I'm Alice Loxton and I present documentaries over on History Hit TV. If you're passionate about all things royal history, sign up to History Hit TV. It's like Netflix, but just for history. You've got hours of ad-free documentaries about all aspects of the past. You can get a huge discount for History Hit TV. Make sure you check out the details in the video description and use the code REALROYALTY, all one word, when you sign up. Now, on with the show.
Pride and Prejudice was published 200 years ago in 1813. It's an archetypal love story, but also a sparkling and acute dissection of genteel Regency society that has captivated readers for generations.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife.
But love it as we might, there's a whole layer of Austen's nuance which is lost to modern readers. Austen's world was taken for granted by her contemporaries, but it's surprisingly distant from us. To understand her novel fully, we need to reimagine the time in which she lived.
In this programme, Alistair Sooke and I are going to step back to try to understand Austen's world. We're going to bring alive those details that have been deadened by the passage of time.
And how are we going to do it? With a groundbreaking experiment.
We're going to recreate in the most accurate way possible the event which lies at the heart of Pride and Prejudice, which drives the entire plot and where the two main characters meet and spar. The Regency Ball. Film adaptations of the book have created an impression of the world of the ball, but we want to know what would have really happened when the candles were lit and the band struck up, and in doing so, try to understand better what Austen was saying.
For one night, we'll turn back the clock 2 centuries at Chawton House, the home of Austen's brother Edward, and recreate a ball as Austen herself would have experienced it. We'll prise open the Regency wardrobe to feel the clothes in which Austen imagined the Bennet sisters. We'll go to the cookbook of her friend and companion Martha Lloyd to conjure the dishes she enjoyed. And we'll listen to dances set to music taken from the Austen family's own music books.
When darkness falls in the ballroom, it will be winter 1813.
By discovering the minute details of the period, the sights, sounds and sensations Austen knew from her own experiences in the ballroom, we'll expose the hidden codes of Regency courtship rituals, see for ourselves the complex hierarchies at work, and reveal the deep structure of one of the greatest love stories ever told.
After this, you'll never read Pride and Prejudice quite the same way again.
Pride and Prejudice is a story of love against the social odds. Elizabeth Bennet is a playful provincial nobody, wooed by Fitzwilliam Darcy, a handsome, wealthy landowner, and they meet at a dance.
The ball is integral to the plot of Pride and Prejudice, and dancing was a key pleasure of Austen's youth. The ball was complex, cruel, and spectacular.
We're going to create an event central to the involuntary bewitchment between Elizabeth and Darcy, and vital to the perpetuation of Regency society. Ensuring we achieve absolute authenticity is a coterie of experts.
Turn around, quick, quick.
Former ballet dancer and authority on Regency dance, Stuart Marsden.
Keep moving up till you get to the end.
Melodies sourced from the Austen family music books.
This looks very similar to Austen's music hand.
Will be orchestrated by music historians and played on original instruments. Costumes will be created with assiduous attention to detail. Foods the author would have tasted herself will be cooked by a leading expert on Regency cuisine, Ivan Day.
This is a very challenging project. To tell you the truth, I don't think it's been done since the Napoleonic Wars in this country.
Feasting our eyes on what Jane Austen saw will bring the background of her world into pin-sharp focus. By filling in the details, the elements Austen didn't need to explain to her readers will strip away the layers of history. The village of Chawton in Hampshire, where Jane Austen lived from 1809, resembles the fictional hamlet of Longbourn, where the Bennet family live.
The village setting is important. Things move very slowly in Austen's fictional world, but they are minutely observed.
Revolution shadowed the Regency. Civil unrest was threatened at home. Cannons were booming across Europe, but in Austen's fictional world, you can hear a pin drop.
With brothers at sea and a cousin guillotined, Austen obviously knew all about the wider world. But in her fiction, she recreated that world in miniature, when human happiness hung on the arrival of a letter, a stolen glance in church, or a misunderstood remark. Austen lived and breathed her moment, but remains utterly timeless.
Pride and Prejudice was prepared for publication in this cottage. Elizabeth Bennet's world was on the upper fringe of Jane Austen's.
The novel was an inside job, a witheringly accurate depiction of the competitive marriage market, but also an analysis of a system that Austen was a part of and whose importance she recognised. The Bennet sisters don't work, but they do have a job, which is polishing the accomplishments that will make them marriageable.
A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing.
The Bennet girls are ladies in waiting, waiting for Mr. Right. But the young men are on a mission too. Only marriage will secure their dynasties. Will Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy plant their affections in Hertfordshire? The community is agog.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. But that famous opening line expresses an essential truth, not just about the Regency, but about pretty much any era in recent human history, which is that a single bloke with a whole load of cash is most definitely a catch. Mr. Bingley causes a bit of a stir when he arrives in Meryton because he's rich, but Mr. Darcy, who's the son of an aristocrat, is fabulously wealthy, 10,000 a year. So both men are desperate to find someone who's going to bear sons. In other words, it's not just Austen's young women, it's also the young men who are under this intense pressure to find a suitable mate. But there's a problem. All contact between young people was strictly controlled.
With so much at stake, contact between the young men and women of the gentry, the landowning class of the Regency, was closely regulated. But there was one place where flirting, intimacy and physical contact was allowed, even encouraged: the ballroom.
Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love.
The ability to dance was key to romantic success, and the movements of the dance mimicked the to and fro of courtship. Clumsiness was sexual suicide. So it's not surprising that it's in the ballroom that the separate worlds of Elizabeth and Darcy collide, creating the possibility for all that follows. Their manoeuvring seems to be about the dance, but beneath the manners, it's all about attraction and rank. The novel's first ball is an assembly, a public event in the town of Meryton. Our reconstruction is inspired by the more pivotal Netherfield Ball, a private affair. The contrast between the rowdier, socially mixed gathering, what ladies called a promiscuous assembly, and an exclusive party of friends would have been sharply drawn for Austen's Regency readers. Professor John Mullen has made Austen's life's work his life's work. Society at that time drew quite a sharp distinction between a public assembly and a private dance.
At the Netherfield Ball, the people come by invitation only, and like any event that's invitation only, it has a higher prestige.
Well, it has some exclusivity.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
You, as a young woman, you know, you might not risk dancing with the butcher or the baker.
That's right. In Meryton, essentially, if you could buy the ticket, you could go, and if you obeyed the conventions, you were an accepted part of the event. Meryton Assembly is a potentially more vulgar occasion,
yes.
and of course, Mr. Darcy and the Bingley sisters do sort of look down upon the Meryton Assembly because of that.
News of a private ball would always start with a personal invitation. Ours had been made with a press from 1820. Printing was expensive. Even Mr. Bingley's invitations would have been produced in bulk, with blank spaces for the date, time, and the name of the guests. Invites would be sent to local dignitaries, parents and chaperones, and most importantly, the genteel young of marriageable age. Austen was 20 when she began work on Pride and Prejudice, the same age as Elizabeth is when the story begins. By then, both should have learnt the key skill that they needed before they could even consider responding to an invitation to a ball: dancing. Our younger ball-goers are dance students. Like polite Regency youngsters, they're learning from a dancing master.
In this world, it's understood. Jane Austen doesn't have to tell anybody, but we have to be told now that people are trained, you know, literally in the movements and how the dances work.
Our dance master is Regency Dance Authority, Stuart Marsden. Rehearsals begin with a lesson in dance history and literature.
We will learn a dance called the Savage Dance, which is an English country dance, and as Mr. Darcy says, any savage can dance. And we're going to do a dance called La Boulangère. Mrs. Bennet exclaimed they danced the Boulangère.
One imagines that the Bennets, even with their sort of woeful lack of tuition and governesses and all that sort of thing, that they will have had a dancing master give them some lessons.
We will do a Lady Caroline Nee's waltz, and then we're going to learn instructions from Jane Austen's cousin, Fanny Austen's lady's companion from 1805, and she stayed with her in 1805.
How central is dancing to the kind of turning points of the novel itself?
Well, I think the whole of the first part of the novel, which sort of sets up, especially importantly, the relationship of Mr. Darcy with Elizabeth, is all done through a series of dances.
Let's start with a cotillion. Jane Austen loved cotillions, so we're going to learn a Retour de Printemps, the return of spring. So English country dances are long-waisted dances. It was tradition that gentlemen asked the girls if they will stand up with you, and they have the right to say yes or no. And it was tradition that if you said no, you would not dance. That meant you weren't dancing at all, right? But just for now, find a partner. Ballroom etiquette, the person of the highest rank will dance closest to the orchestra.
In an essentially quite enclosed community like this imaginary Hertfordshire town of Meryton, it's the main sort of venue for people literally trying out partners. You know, Sir William Lucas, he's a buffoon, but he sort of comments on how good Elizabeth is at dancing, and it seems quite clear that she and Mr. Darcy are good at dancing together.
So they're compatible?
Absolutely, and when Mr. Darcy...
Physically compatible?
Physically compatible.
The ball is going to be set 1813, and during this time, steps changed dramatically. And it was all because of the French Revolution. Napoleon came into power, and this whole noble dancing of Baroque, nobody could do it anymore, because all the aristocrats had been gone. In fact, Jane Austen's cousin, her husband, had been guillotined. So the steps sort of changed over time. So by the time we're doing the ball now, we'll actually be doing what's called quadrille steps. So we go skip change with the right, skip change with the left, skip change with the left, assemble, assemble.
And you get this extraordinary effect, I think, in the novel that would have been much stronger for her first readers who would have sort of seen the dance. They would have seen it.
Ready? One with the right, one with the left, one with the right, assemble, assemble.
They would have seen the couples lining up and, in a way, perhaps even kind of heard the music. And yet, in the novel, there's this incredible focus in on two people who could be in the middle of the Sahara Desert, you know, from all the attention that is being paid to anything else. And the novel mimics that extraordinary concentration of them upon each other.
The dance moves are rather more complicated than I'd expected. That said, there was rather an appeal to trying it out for myself.
It's fantastic. I've just arrived at the studios to watch the very first dance rehearsal of the entire process. And I was wondering about what Regency dance would look like. And it's very, very prancy. There's a lot of skipping, as you can see. And in a sense, maybe it's not going to look as alien as I thought it would.
I didn't get fast enough. Go behind. Number two's move out.
Stuart's quite a taskmaster at times, which is a good thing, because we haven't got very long to rehearse.
OK.
I'm actually sweating, and I didn't actually think I'd sweat. I was like, oh, it's just going to be fine, a couple of bit of partner work, and I'm actually dripping.
Yeah, I suggest you bring some Emigel next week.
You can feel it in your calves. I can't understand how they did it in that time.
Right. No, you're on the beat. You're on the beat. It's really hard, isn't it?
The steps were difficult, and dance masters would publish manuals, many of them designed to promote their dance schools and supplement their income. Edward Payne's Dance Manual of 1814 lists prices ranging from 5 shillings and sixpence for a single lesson to £1 1 shilling for 6 lessons. Dance tuition could be a lucrative business.
OK, well done. OK, well, hey, stop. You've got another 7 to go.
You're proper dancers, aren't you?
Yes, we're in training.
So when he says do a pas de rigueur, whatever it is, you know what he means. And I'm still struggling with the kind of, you do 1, 2, 3, and then...
We'll get there.
And then there's about another 18 steps. Yeah, thanks. So it's not easy.
Right, lunch. Go for lunch. Go, go, go.
This morning, we've obviously done a few dances. The one
2.
I think I got in 2. It felt like a lot more.
I know, it feels... the cotillion's gone.
The one I was doing was bloody complicated, I thought.
The cotillion. It's a real tour de force for the brain, just to remember.
But dancers in Austin's time didn't necessarily have to memorise every step. They might rely on a cleverly concealed crib sheet.
Here we go. There's a dance fan for the year 1792.
Hang on. This is a fan covered in music with the steps as well.
With the steps on as well.
This is a crib sheet. That's kind
Such a
of
cheat.
cheating.
That's such a
cheat.
cheat.
They were common things.
Yeah, but they're paper, so hardly any survive.
These fans were the perfect tool for flirtation. A temporary fluttering screen hiding the lips, framing and eroticising the eyes.
Whilst dancing in Austin's era could be delightful, it was also more relentless and gruelling than you might expect. Making matters even more challenging, your clothes revealed every mistake and misstep. Assembling the authentic clothing for our ball is Professor Hilary Davidson. Many screen adaptations of Pride and Prejudice dress the actors in the height of Regency fashion. This, though, misses a crucial point. In Austin's time, the outfits reflected the range of social ranks who would have attended these balls. Social division by cut, colour and texture would have been immediately evident to Austin's readers.
Do you think some will be more fashion forward than others?
In this period, there's a far more personal input into clothing styles than perhaps we're used to, because all clothing is made new. Very little is available ready-made.
Yes, it's bespoke.
Bespoke. So the fabric that you choose, the cut that you choose, the trimmings that you put on the bottom of your skirt, there's far more of a personal input.
Do you think people's position in society, their age and I suppose their character would all be mapped in the dress they would wear for the ball?
It would, absolutely. And what's more, people within the community can read that fairly precisely. They all know exactly what that means and what the story is behind the clothing.
Yes. And that's a language that's lost to us, isn't it?
It is.
Our ballgoers are being fitted for various kinds of clothing, as they would have been in Austin's time. Guests representing men who were fashion conscious and who could afford it will be wearing the menswear trends of autumn-winter 1813. Colours are muted and the silhouette athletic, exactly the looks that attracted fellow ball guests when Messrs Bingley, Hurst and Darcy arrived at the Meryton Assembly.
Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman. But his friend Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year.
Other guests will be a little more frugal in appearance. But to modern eyes, they're all rather striking.
I like the look of it a lot. So much, in fact, I'm wondering if you've got a spare one. What does it feel like to wear?
It's very tight-fitting, but you're not uncomfortable. It's not so tight that you can barely walk or barely move. You still have that sense of presence. So I have broad shoulders, so it fits it very well, but like it makes your back just stand up rather than... You can never slouch in that at all.
So maybe it was the ramrod stance imposed by this clothing which lay behind the visual appeal of Darcy and Bingley when they graced Meryton with their presence. The clothing is rather more revealing than I'd expected.
It is very tempting to just keep your hands in it feels like you need some pockets.
So men are going to be wearing stockinged legs and low-heeled shoes. We've got lovely breeches with this full front and quite a complicated opening. And then at the back, they've got this little bit of room for adjustment. There's a lot of room in here. Often men are just taking the long tails of their shirt and tucking them between their legs to use for underwear. And the other important thing about this is that we're really starting to see, frankly, the groin area.
Bit of room there, yeah. And then you've got somewhere in here.
If we take these trousers and have a look at one of the jackets.
This is big, isn't it? I mean, it's too big.
What's happened is that the whole front skirt of the coat has been cut off. And this is a very new fashion. What you really notice is the groin visible for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, over 100 years.
Exactly.
Our female ballgoers will all be wearing authentic underwear, from corsets to petticoats. The muddied hem of a petticoat was a plot device for Austen. It allowed the fashion-conscious Bingley sisters to mock carefree Elizabeth Bennet. But it didn't bother Mr. Darcy, already electrified by her fine eyes.
I feel like I've gone definitely back in time.
Looks gorgeous.
But what was going on underneath the muslins? Let's enter the mysterious world of lingerie.
The women in our period, it's often thought that they're not wearing underwear, but they are. They're wearing at least a chemise, made of cotton or linen, and then another petticoat on top, and then there's actually quite a lot going on below the skirt. So all of this kind of mass would have been women's daily experience.
Although in the 18th and early 19th century, people are obsessed with propriety and the modesty of young women. Actually, they're knickerless.
They're knickerless, and even when the knickers come in, the legs are still open at the crotch, and you actually don't join up the crotches of knickers until I think the late 19th, early 20th century. So, crotchless knickers were the norm.
Many guests at a country ball would have made their own clothes or altered existing garments. Hilary is hand-making one dress that Austen, deft with needle and thread, might have made herself for a ball.
Right.
I'll be your dressmaker's assistant. Tell me what to do.
So, what I need you to do, Amanda, is if you can just lift your arm, Lizzie.
This will be a dress that's been altered by generations of wearers. A hand-me-down hybrid frock featuring elements of early 19th century design, but also traces of previous eras.
I've cut it off. If I'd used a dress from about 1800, we'd actually have a narrower bust, and we'd be having to add length onto it.
So this is not dissimilar to a family at home kind of remaking an older sister's dress, say.
Exactly.
Cutting it down. Well, and a lot of the value is in the textile itself, isn't it?
Exactly. And
not so much in the labour.
And especially if you've got a good Indian muslin, what I'm going to do, like they did at the time, is kind of add a drawstring. And I'm going to give you princess sleeves. From about sort of 1811, 1812, you start seeing these little puffed sleeves. I'm going to use this as the base and then give you much puffier sleeves. That's as far as I go. Pin that in there. One of the big differences is there's just less fabric in the skirt at this period.
So a flatter fall at the front.
Totally flat fall at the front.
Go on, give us a demo, love.
Or stuff like that.
Does that feel all right for you to do?
Yeah, it feels fine. Like it didn't feel at any point like, oh, this might make me trip or anything.
The point of all the clothing that ball-goers, moneyed and less well-off, would have worn was the public display of assets, financial and physical, real and imaginary.
You're going to dance? No. Absolutely. Oh, come on. I'm Stuart, by the way. Nice to meet you. Come on, Alistair gave it a go.
Like Alistair, I came to the studio to observe the young ball-goers practising their steps. But joining in for a moment, I began to feel a little of the joy that meant the energetic Lydia Bennet just couldn't stop dancing.
Finish where you need to start. It would be very nice
I
once
think
you've
I'm
done
done for now.
The characters never laughed. It was considered.
That's me, he's telling me off there because I got the giggles in it. Laughing's always very bad in women in the past. It's a sign of sexual availability. You shouldn't show your teeth. It's a sign of being garrulous, plebeian, vulgar. But that's one of the reasons why I like Lizzie Bennet so much, because she does seem to drive the plot with her own laughter. So that's one of the things, her irreverence, I think, is one of the things that makes her so attractive and easy for modern audiences to digest.
Regency dancing, it turns out, is anything but the prim and proper activity we see in costume dramas. It was a chance to show off athletic prowess and a prime opportunity for physical and verbal flirtation. But of course it didn't take place in the airy spaciousness of a dance studio. What were the actual conditions in which ball-goers exhibited their hard-won skills?
Chawton is different from Netherfield Park, but it is a house that Austen knew and loved. She came here to enjoy the hospitality of her wealthy brother. Just the sort of place, then, where private Regency balls would have taken place.
Well, this is the space where we're actually going to put the ball on. What a great space. The thing about Edward Austen's house is that it doesn't feel like it's been made into some naff country hotel. It feels like, I think it always has done. Jane's house is just down the road, and we know that she came here. We don't know for sure that she would have danced in a ball in this room, but if there was a big social gathering thrown by her brother, this is the obvious place to have put that on. And even if she wasn't dancing, you could imagine her standing by the fire, drinking, being the chaperone, watching, seeing what was going on. It's not going to take much to make this feel as authentic as possible, to take us right back to 1813. Particularly because the whole thing's going to be candlelit. So in fact, looking around, the only potential problem might be these electric chandeliers.
Lisa White, who advises the National Trust on accurate illumination, will show us exactly how a ball was lit 2 centuries ago.
It's splendid.
Isn't it?
Splendid.
It's beautiful.
Yes, yes.
So if you imagine that we're recreating the Netherfield ball and Mr. Bingley wants to throw a really good party, how's he going to sort out the lighting? What would he do?
Well, if Mr. Bingley was out to impress, he would have lots of light, especially wax candles, not just in the chandeliers, but all around the room. And he would increase the light with beautiful mirrors to reflect the light as well, because artificial light meant social status. If you could afford lots, you were obviously very rich. Beeswax candles were the smart candles. Grand people like Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy and the Bennets would have had in their best rooms. Servants and poor people lived with tallow candles. They were cheap. They were made from beef fat or pig fat, and they were smelly. It was a bit like living in a fast food shop.
I love this idea that the candles would have been a form of conspicuous consumption. It's a sort of showing off, because Austen is so attuned to all of those nuances of status. It's quintessential Austen, and people coming in would immediately have read the room, would they?
Absolutely, yes. And very often candles in the 18th century were sold by length, and they would burn for 4 hours or 6 hours, so that you didn't waste very much. And you can imagine that if you were one of the young Miss Bennets and you arrived for a party and there were 4-hour candles, you'd think, oh no, you know, I want to stay longer than that. Or if you were Mr. Bennet and you arrived and you saw 6-hour candles, oh my God, we're going to be here forever.
The candles for our ball would have Mr. Bennet in despair. They'll burn for 8 hours. An event of the scale of the Netherfield ball might have been lit by up to 300 of these candles, at a cost of around £15, a year's wages for a manservant. Balls were expensive affairs.
After all the exertion of strenuous dancing, in a candlelit and wood-fired room, perspiring ball-goers would have worked up quite an appetite. So in Austen's time, the ball also included a chance for the host to refresh his guests and show off with a lavish supper. At our ball, the supper will be cooked by leading expert on historical food, Ivan Day.
These are some of the recipes. A ball supper for 20 people, and that's it there, you see.
Amongst the sauces, for our sauces, pies and blancmanges, dishes of fish, fowl and game, are recipes that Austen might have cooked herself.
I do stuff like this all the time, serving food in this very old-fashioned way, which is called à la française, where all the dishes are put on the table at the same time, but on a smaller scale. It became extinct as a way of dining in the middle of the 19th century because it is actually very tricky. These young chefs that I've got are absolutely brilliant. They've taken on techniques that they've never done before. This is a freezing pot or a sorbetière. Now, don't get your hands cold. We're going to make Georgian ice cream. Food, combined with the extraordinary decorative arts of the table of this period, is really quite excellent. And I'm hoping that it will be a revelation.
That's really delicious.
One dish that was on nearly every ball menu was white soup. Recipes vary, but a veal stock was a common base, as were powdered almonds, pudding rice, bacon, anchovies and cream. Ivan's version draws on the cookbook of Austen's friend, Martha Lloyd.
Pressured to set the date for the Netherfield ball, Mr. Bingley laughed that he'd issue his invitations when he'd made enough white soup.
Our guests will experience a feast for all the senses. But Elizabeth's supper was poisoned by the sound of her mother, boasting of daughter Jane's marital prospects, and the sight of Mr. Darcy listening in.
The dining room is the great scene of humiliation for Elizabeth Bennet. But food is drenched with ideas of status in the early 19th century. Game is the great symbol of the gentry, and that's why Mrs. Bennet invites Mr. Bingley to come and shoot partridge on her land.
Partridge pie is just one of the delights that Ivan Day is dishing up for our ball. His recipe comes from the housekeeper's instructor from 1805.
And this is very much a symbol of upper-class dining.
The pie contains 4 whole birds cooked in herbs, liver, bacon and mushrooms. Before serving, it's opened and filled with veal gravy and orange juice.
The prize inside these things is to stick in your fork and pull out an entire bird.
What sort of opportunities do you think the food and the eating offers Austen to display character?
Well, the food's really important because there's always a subtext. Food is a very important sign of status throughout the novel. At the Bingleys' Netherfield ball, they're going to have really good food to show everybody their status and their wealth. When Elizabeth eventually gets to meet Mr. Darcy's sister, Georgiana, it was an extraordinary display of food status. They're given grapes and nectarines and peaches, which, you know, in Derbyshire in the early 19th century is quite a kind of achievement.
While some of the cooking could have been done in advance, a Regency kitchen would simmer with stress on the night. Wherever possible, Ivan Day is recreating the taste of the past by using Georgian kitchen equipment. But the ancient Chawton range isn't in working condition.
You're confident that despite using this modern technology, you're going to be able to recreate the taste of 1813?
Yeah, but we don't want it just to taste like it, we want it to look like it as well, because this is going to be sitting on authentic Regency silver.
That's what I'm realising, that the spectacle of the food is almost as important as the way it tastes.
Well, it's even more important, actually.
For a ball. I mean, it's all about ostentation.
Yeah,
show.
and you've invested an enormous amount of money in all that stuff. It's a total expression of your status.
The thing that's interesting is that if you've got silver platter, that's a highly ornate, artificial thing.
Yeah.
And then you're plonking on top of it a beautifully cooked bird, but you can see the talons, the claws, the neck, the beak.
The trouble is you're bringing your sensibilities about food. A lot of people enjoyed actually eating the head of the chicken because it cooks to a wonderful mush, and you just put it in your mouth and you suck the eyes out and the brains out through the beak, and it's a wonderful gastronomic experience.
I'm going to need the soup tureen first.
Ivan Day's 63-dish supper will be served on solid silver salvers, platters, dishes and tureens, all treasures from the Georgian and Regency era. Amongst the cutlery, spoons once used by the Prince Regent. The hoard is in the care of Christopher Hartop, an authority on English silver.
Yeah, this is all going to have to move up.
The savoury's over. Ivan will tempt our diners with jellies and blancmanges, or flummeries.
What I've got here is a really interesting mould which dates from about 1790, and it's a little bit of a delicate operation. And what you're seeing there is what food really looked like. This one depicts the cipher of George III. Now, I rarely get stressed, but technically this is the nightmare one. Now, this is the big moment of... This is one of the most famous of all Georgian jellies. It's called a Solomon's Temple. So this might have pride of place on the table. It looks very different from the food that we eat now. Sensibilities of people in the Georgian period, very different to ours. They have different expectations. But this is what we've lost. This is the food that has been totally and utterly forgotten about. Mr. Bingley is really expecting a great deal from his kitchen staff for what is the big moment of his year. It must have been a great deal of tension down there, I think, in the servants' quarters. Those classes above the Bennets, like Bingley and Darcy and Lady Catherine and the rest of them, they lived in a world that was just full of stuff like this.
So we've looked at the sumptuous food, the costume, the dance lessons and the lighting. But what we haven't yet explored is music. What did people really dance to? Jane Austen was a keen musician. Within her own collection of piano music are hidden clues to the kind of tunes she may have had in mind while writing the Netherfield ball scenes. The archive at Southampton University contains the Austen family music books, curated by Professor Janice Brooks. We know from her letters that Austen copied out sheet music. Pieces in these musical scrapbooks include tunes she probably played herself.
The crucial question is, does this volume contain anything actually written by Jane?
Probably. There are a couple that are a very good match. This looks very similar to Austen's early music hand.
It's so tantalising if this is actually Jane Austen's hand. There's a glittering precision to that.
Yeah, this
is
is
very
a very
Jane.
precise copy. And in fact, one of her other nieces, Caroline Austen, talks about how Jane Austen played from her manuscript books that she had copied out, and she makes a comment about the writing, and she says it was so neat, it was as if it were print. Let's see if I can find the thing. You want to see that?
Ah, right, brilliant. That's amazing. So what is this? This is a profile of a woman, a girl. This is amazing. Presumably, this is someone who's got slightly bored whilst they're transcribing the music, and they've decided to do a doodle in the margins.
This is what I'm very, very fancifully calling my little Jane Austen musical portrait. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Don't say it's fanciful.
Let's
not pretend. Let's tell them it's right.
No, we don't do that in academia.
I thought that was really exciting because feeling so close to Jane Austen's hand is a very rare thing. Certainly for me, that was the first time I'd seen potentially her own handwriting, the way she wrote music. And for such a prolific writer, there was surprisingly little of her own hand that survived. For instance, many of the letters have been burnt. We don't actually have the first draft of Pride and Prejudice. And it was so eloquent to open up this quite unprepossessing, quite potentially uninteresting looking book with its yellowed old pages, mottled, foxed. Just felt so old. And to suddenly recreate this sense of a whole community, a real social context, which fired and enthused Jane every single day of her life.
In the piano music that Austen copied so assiduously are the melodies she enjoyed. There are classical pieces, folk songs, and traditional airs, and others to which she would herself have danced at balls. Popular music at the time was widely collected, but instead of being notated for orchestras, it was summarised for the piano. To recreate the music of the ballroom, they have to be rearranged, a task undertaken by Professor William Drabkin. Naturally, he's using a piano from 1796.
The things that you've got here are what I have done to some music that I was given. I don't want to overdo this because, after all, the focus is on the dancing, not on the musicians in a gallery, wherever they may happen to be. I mean, people come to dance, and the musicians are there to provide music for the dance. They're not there to perform great music, if I could put it that way, if I could put it
so
somewhat
no
crudely.
flourishes.
Ball guests may not have been concentrating on the music, but they were certainly concentrating on each other. Guests at a Regency ball knew that appearance was everything. Austen tells how on the evening of the Netherfield ball, Elizabeth Bennet dressed with more than usual care, a process that would have involved more than just her clothes.
For someone whose letters betray such a love of fashion, Austen gives scant detail about the lotions and potions that must have enhanced the Bennet sisters' natural charms. But there's a clue to her ambivalence about artifice. The sour Bingley sisters sneer at Lizzie Bennet's healthy, outdoorsy complexion, so brown and coarse.
Makeup has always been risky. Too much was the sign of a trollop. So did nice girls really reach for the rouge pot? It seems they did. Running the cosmetics team for our ball is Sally Pointer, a leading authority on the makeup of historical makeup.
Do you make all these?
I do, yes. Yeah.
So you sit at home in your kitchen, doing a bit of kitchen chemistry?
Yeah, I'm an archaeologist by training and I research early recipes. Most of them use ingredients that could be got fairly easily and don't use any equipment that you didn't have in a normal kitchen. So it was accessible to fairly ordinary women. One of the main features of the look are quite rosy cheeks. We could use alkanet root, little blue flowers, but the root gives us lovely clear, sheer red colour. This is cochineal root.
I've read many studies about I've had no idea
Each
what
one
they
of
look like.
those is a beetle. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that accurately reconstructed cosmetics have ever been used on an entire cast.
Oh, really?
I believe that this is making history doing this today.
And what of the men? Elizabeth Bennet is initially interested in dashing officer Mr. Wickham. Was his élan boosted by time at the mirror? Did his cheeks match his coat?
Oh, we got a red coat. Would you really have imagined that a red coat would have worn makeup for a dance?
Interestingly, small amounts of rouge turn up on male toiletry accounts right through to the First World War, particularly on officers.
It does seem to me are these stick-on sideburns?
They are.
But this is the period when the wig increasingly has been abandoned, but there would still be an older generation, I think, who would hang on to their wigs.
I believe we have one or two gentlemen who are going to be wigged and possibly powdered.
So representing the goatee old men of the...
Well,
sorry,
I've already
representing
seen- yes.
the gouty old
Yes,
men.
yes.
As the Netherfield ball approached, anticipation was frothing in the villages.
The thrill of getting into your party clothes is surely unchanged, but for a Regency dance, that anticipation was rocket-fueled by weeks of preparation. We know from Austen's letters that she was interested in fabrics, but in her fiction, she makes an interest in frills a sure sign of moral weakness, and that's why the younger Bennet sisters are slaves to haberdashery.
The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies who were usually tempted thither 3 or 4 times a week to pay their duty to their aunt and to a milliner's shop just over the way.
In the costume truck, Hilary Davidson is dressing our guests in the garments that would have expressed exactly where a Mrs. Bennet or a Mr. Darcy would have stood on the Meryton social ladder. The quality and style of clothes were then, as now, powerful social signifiers. And Bingley's sisters, Mrs. Hurst and Caroline Bingley, pay beady attention to what they and others wear.
Well, this is made out of silk. This is possibly one of Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley.
Oh, really?
And Mrs. Bennet talks about Mrs. Hurst's gown, that she's never seen anything so elegant.
Yes. So, Hilary, is this a simpler dress of the kind that perhaps a Miss Bennet might have worn?
Still possibly quite fancy for a country ball. So I'm thinking this is a Lydia Bennet, who of all the girls loves fashion the most. This is more like what Mrs. Bennet would have worn.
The cap is the sign of matronly modesty, isn't
Yes.
You just see the transformation in how people treat you.
So you feel you've got a certain amount of authority
Yes,
then?
absolutely.
Through your bonnet?
Oh, yeah, totally.
We're into sort of more age-appropriate dressing here. I mean, Mrs. Bennet's not that old by modern terms.
No, in fact, I think people are probably surprised to learn that she's only about 41, 42, and actually she's often played by much older actresses.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So I think she still has genuine claims to being, you know, alluring. Cotton, wool and taffeta whisper to the expert, but muslin is the textile that most of us associate with the ladies of the Regency.
This is 19th century muslin.
This is beautifully diaphanous, and it is, you know, one of the great legends, is it not, that women, you know, these dresses were practically see-through, and that women might even can wet their muslins to reveal their limbs.
You're not going to be wearing that to a dance or something like that. It's an extremity. Put a bit of water onto it and see what happens, like you've just been running through a fountain.
Oh yes, or Venus arising from a shell or something.
If there really was this dampened muslin, it probably wouldn't even pass in St James's. We're talking private parties, where women... Very private parties.
Actually, you'd see everything through that.
This is the sort of ensemble that I probably imagine Mr. Darcy would be wearing.
Oh, really?
I'm not sure he'd go so far as the red. I think he's be quite conservative in his taste. Look at the quality of the buttons here. They're not too ostentatious and very well-fitting breeches, which is, of course, a very important part of Regency men's dress.
So this is our Mr. Darcy, so £10,000 a year.
£10,000 a year.
Mr. Darcy was extremely wealthy. The garments of a less well-off gentleman, like Mr. Bingley's brother-in-law, are more surface than substance.
Perhaps the person we could pin this on is Mr. Hurst. Mrs. Hurst is explained as marrying a man of more fashion than fortune. You can see just how flashy this waistcoat is by comparison with our Mr. Darcy's quite restrained one.
Invitations to a country ball might also extend to the sons of local gentlemen.
This is made out of wool, and the colours, they're far more restrained.
So this is provincial gentility as opposed to metropolitan fashion?
Absolutely.
Hilary has been burning the midnight oil.
So, Hilary, can we at long last see the dress?
Time to reveal the dress she's been making by hand. A hybrid of various hand-me-down garments that the Bennet girls and Austen herself would have recognised, and at which the Bingley sisters would have sneered.
This is the little white dress of the Regency period. You can make it as elaborate or as simple as you want to.
And given that Jane Austen herself was good at embroidery, do you think there'd be an expectation that you would improve the dress yourself?
If you're a good needlewoman, which you're expected to be, it's one of the female accomplishments, you can absolutely show off your work in your clothing.
So who would wear this dress?
I think this is an Elizabeth Bennet dress.
Oh.
In the final hours before the ball, there's a thrill of anticipation throughout Chawton House. Austen was well aware of the tingling excitement generated by waiting for an event that brought the possibility of life-changing romance, delivering heat and light in the dead of winter.
If there had not been a Netherfield ball to prepare for and talk of, the younger Miss Bennets would have been in a pitiable state at this time. For from the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, there was such a succession of rain as prevented their walking to Meryton once.
Perhaps we've neglected balls as arenas of not just social but sexual interaction.
Yeah, you know, in 19th century novels, there are lots of balls. But in Pride and Prejudice, it has a sort of minute kind of attention to the nuance and gesture of every single detail is so dramatically telling. No other novelist does it as brilliantly. And there is this sort of extraordinary structural thing that, you know, there are a series of dances and you can see them sort of manoeuvring around each other, sort of denying what is becoming ever more evident. I mean, especially Mr. Darcy, this absolutely proper person, but actually sensual, and that the dance is the epitome of his mix of correctness and restraint on the one hand and fervour on the other.
Like Austen herself, the genteel readers who first devoured Pride and Prejudice knew the sights and sounds of the ballroom. She was free to concentrate on the drama of emotion, leaving modern readers with tantalisingly few clues about the ball itself.
That
economy can sometimes be frustrating.
Yeah, and trying to find out about the historical background to things that happen in Jane Austen can be really, really important because she is asking you to see things which she could be confident her first readers could see and which we can't see anymore.
Austen's economy of style is particularly apparent when it comes to the specifics of what goes on in the dining room. The food we've prepared is, like the clothes and the makeup, almost theatrical in its flamboyance. The Netherfield supper features some of the most important exchanges in the novel. Now we begin to see what the dining room might have looked like.
You're all professional waiters. Well, Ivan and I are going to try and make you unlearn everything you've learnt, because this is going to be completely different to any table you've ever served at. We're going to have 3 rows of dishes laid out when the people sit down.
At each end of the table will be a soup tureen. Now, there are 2 soups. There's a choice. I don't know how it was done, but I would imagine one of you will be in charge at this end, and then the waiters will take the hare soup to Colonel Blenkinsop over here, and white soup to Jane Bennet over there. You'd be able to do this if you just apply some of the common sense from your experience. But it'd be fun to see how you get on.
So we're going to lay the fork on the left, to our eyes upside down, blade of the knife facing into the plate.
I mean, I'm amazed at how many dishes are going to be on here.
The sheer logistics of it is what we found daunting. Keeping track of each dish and then having to go down to the kitchen, decorate it, and then bring it up and put it in exactly the right position is very, very complex.
The trouble with this sort of dining is that no one really says very much about it. Jane Austen only gives us little clues.
So how are you so sure that what we're going to recreate will be what would have been at Netherfield?
We can pick up things, for instance, in the literature about dining, which was published at the period. The trouble is, it's open to debate, and the only way of finding out is to do it. And that's what this is really about. In recreating the Netherfield Ball Supper, we're hoping to bring to life this forgotten world of Georgian dining, which Jane would have been very, very familiar with.
Do you feel that it will give us a more nuanced understanding of the novel?
Of the whole milieu, really, of this extraordinary period in British history, which is one of our finest.
We've got a table plan here. This is based on one published in 1815, so we know it's pretty authentic.
As dusk approaches and the beginning of the ball draws near, one other crucial and surprising element has to be added to the reconstruction.
Lisa, as you can see, we've got this electric moon.
Moonlight would have been extremely important, not only to help light guests as they came towards the ball, but even more important for when they left. The last highwayman to be hanged for his felonies was only a couple of years after Pride and Prejudice was published.
The thin light of the moon was enough to make journeys safer to and from the venue. But the light inside the ballroom had a different purpose. Film electricians are more used to putting light in than taking it out, but the electric chandeliers must go for something rather older.
Lisa and I have got a little bit of light work to do as we create the conditions under which Darcy first fell underneath Elizabeth's spell.
No sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes.
Two hours after moonrise, our guests are gathering. In the dreary winters of a small village, a ball was a fairy tale highlight in the enveloping darkness.
And out here, in the hallway, the common passages, we're in the 21st century, we're ready to observe, but as soon as anyone passes through this door, they're in 1813, or as near as we can get it.
When Elizabeth Bennet arrived at the Netherfield Ball, she was out to conquer the heart of Mr. Wickham. But a few short hours and just 2 dances later, and her furious thoughts are all fixed on Mr. Darcy. But like all the guests, Lizzie came to see and be seen, keen to please the man on whom she'd set her sights.
everything that happens in the novel, all the romances, and a lot of the sort of misunderstandings start at the ball. And in a way, Jane Austen is sort of making fictional use of something which must have been the case in a small town like Meryton. This is simply the biggest event of the year. It's the moment that lights the blue touch paper.
I've never seen that before.
The excitement is palpable, isn't it, John? You know, the hubbub, everybody arriving. Is this a key moment of the drama?
Absolutely, it's all part of it because you're seeing who, not just who's wearing what, but who's there.
So no guest list goes round the village?
Well, normally there'd be lots of gossip, of course, but you're explicitly told in Pride and Prejudice that the Bennets have been cooped up for 5 days by the rain. And so Elizabeth thinks Wickham is going to be there, and she has no way of knowing from gossip that he's not going to be.
Also, presumably, cabin fever is mounting.
Absolutely, they've been pent up.
So it's sort of ratcheted up to a new height.
Imagine what state Lydia's in, can't you? You know, pent up for 5 days, she's ready to go.
Coming in, they're all watching each other. This will be the moment when you get the first glimpse of the taffetas and think, will my own muslin cut the mustard?
Absolutely, and you of course, it's a big deal in Pride and Prejudice because this is the Bingleys' ball, and the Bingleys are sort of London people, and they wear more fashionable clothes, so these Hertfordshire folk are all sort of jostling for their approval as well as trying to compete with each other.
So I hadn't thought about this at all, but of course they need to change their shoes, because you can't walk through the snow and you're dancing pumps.
You're not going to go dancing in a pair of really heavy boots. You want to be changing into something that's really soft and light, and just in case it's the foot. This isn't something we do anymore. We forget that they had this culture of changing the shoes.
I mean, this looks like the kind of thing that a ballerina might wear today, but everyone's doing it, all of the blokes as well.
This is the origins of ballet shoes.
So you would inevitably have your own pair of dancing shoes?
Of course, you'd be coming to the ball with your lovely little bag of shoes, changing them, and you're ready to go.
I mean, practically speaking as well, our ballroom's got wooden floorboards. If you had heavy boots, that'd be making a tremendous racket as well.
You couldn't hear the musicians over that kind of noise.
Contemporary accounts speak of dancing shoes being shredded in a single night through the exertions of the dancers.
It's also a kind of parade of social distinctions.
How you arrive at the ball is in itself significant. Who has their own carriage? Who has to get a lift from somebody else? The Bennets have their own carriage. They're actually quite well off. Yeah. But we're told that the horses for the carriage have to be used on the farm as well. So they're sort of slightly in between grand and actually shabby genteel. The carriage is one of the key markers in Jane Austen's novels and in reality in the early 19th century between really the wealthy and the merely genteel. You need about £1,000 a year to own a carriage.
Because it's not just the carriage, is it? It's all the horses and all the tackle and the
Yes,
stabling.
yes.
A man is even linked to the nature of the transport he
How
has.
grand a carriage, how big a carriage, and of course going to the ball, it's a simple fact. Do you depend on somebody else for a lift there and a lift back? Are you going to have to leave when somebody else does? Or are you going to be like Mrs. Bennet? She's in command of her destiny and she specially makes sure that the Bennet carriage is the last to leave.
The guests are presented to the host and hostess. This was the moment when, at the Meryton Assembly Ball, Mr. Bingley made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room.
All this formal introducing, do you think it's significant?
I suppose it doesn't seem unreasonable for the Netherfield Ball.
Dr. Hannah Gregg is a specialist in the history of high society.
Hierarchy pervades all social encounters in the kinds of community that Austen writes about.
This is, in fact, a private ball. Isn't that a crucial distinction for the Regency gentility?
Yeah, there's a fundamental distinction. A private event is invitation only, whereas a public assembly is a much more mixed company.
There must have been lots of people who thought that they were better than the rest.
And Austen makes that very clear, and particularly in Pride and Prejudice, where Darcy is, at the Meryton Assembly, appears to be too proud to participate in any of the dances. And he says, I didn't know any of the other women present, so I only danced with Bingley's sisters.
And as she says, though, and no one can be introduced at a ball.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to be standing and form sets for the cotillion, the Return de Breton.
Austen makes very clear that Darcy and the Bingleys feel relatively close to high-ranking London circles, and that they had a knowledge of what it was to be fashionable.
This is the cotillion, the first dance of the evening, and this is the dance that I tried out a bit in rehearsal, and I can attest it's hard work. But then the entire ball is hard work with physical, social and emotional investment and cost.
Cotillions were French versions of traditional English country dances. The French tended to dance at home in small salons, and the square shapes of the cotillion worked well in tight domestic spaces. Their formations were more intimate, and you were much more likely to dance with people of the same rank and expertise.
John, does it make any difference to you seeing a reenactment before you, being in such close proximity with the dancing?
Yeah, it makes a real difference. I mean, apart from anything else, I always laughed at Mr. Collins for being such a terrible dancer and Elizabeth suffering the first two dances with him. But actually, you feel a bit of sneaking sympathy for him because these dances are beautifully elaborate but really tricky. You need to really learn them, and it's not surprising that he finds the challenge just much too much.
We should have some clodhoppers in there, don't you think?
Well, you can imagine there must have been a few people who were not as proficient. But I think, obviously, some of them were. People like Elizabeth. You imagine that she and Mr. Bingley and Jane and Mr. Darcy probably were very good at doing it. And when you see them doing this, you think, the opportunities to make a Mr. Collins of yourself are absolutely legion.
It goes on forever.
It does. It adds a new sort of sense, doesn't it? Or for me it does, that when Elizabeth's dancing with Mr. Collins, she's having to endure it for a long time. Seeing this man do the wrong things and having everybody watch you, and of course, watch Elizabeth and Mr. Collins and think of them as possible partners.
You could tell they were absolutely exhausted by the end of it. They were tired, you could see. Next, we have the Savage dance, and then we have the waltz, which is very, very pretty, and I think one of their favourite dances. And then finally, Boulanger, which will kill them.
You all came out looking hot.
I've literally never experienced that before.
Just non-stop.
We never ever have done a dance that's longer than 5 minutes, ever. So it's great.
And that's just the first one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You know, Stuart was talking a lot about there's lots of time for flirtation, for talking.
Yes.
Was there any, or was it all just kind of like dance, 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 do the moves?
There was. In a partner that I had, we had a moment where we were just like, hey again. And it was kind of like flirty in that way, rather than like making the move. It was kind of like, it's us again.
Who was that?
Matt Jolly.
I hear you had a flirty moment. Yeah. Good. The ball is working. That's excellent.
I think I can marry him.
You should try the dance.
You're right. I should try it.
Maybe you should put on the costume and...
I have had a costume fitted, and I am thinking that I should...
You need to. You need to find your wife.
Yeah.
The waltz.
We should.
Shall we?
Is that an offer, an invitation?
I'd love to.
I look forward to dancing with you.
And you too, sir.
Good.
Everybody looks lovely. It seems to be pure pleasure, but presumably there are other tensions under the surface which, we can't see.
Yeah, and I think that's actually revealed by a recreation like this. This is more than just a kind of scene of romance and young flirtations. There's also a whole range of other sorts of social interactions and connections that are being made or broken at a ball. So perhaps a business transaction might be happening in one corner. Someone might be trying to approach a patron to try and enhance their trade. There might be distant family members trying to reacquaint themselves with more privileged, people within their family.
in a way, it's a kind of microcosm of society then, and on all the sort of social obligations and networks and alliances and tensions. Yeah.
Helping to lubricate those tensions, liberal supplies of Portuguese wine and fortified Negus punch. In the kitchen, Ivan is preparing a beverage for later, a stimulant without which no Regency ball was complete.
I'm making punch à la Romaine, Roman punch, and it's basically a mixture of alcohol, usually rum or brandy, with lemon, water, Italian meringue, which is basically egg whites that have been whipped up into a real froth, and then a very, very hot sugar syrup is dribbled in, champagne, and it's just frozen. This is actually a refreshment that's going to be served perhaps in an interval, and it had become really popular in about 1813.
This isn't the only frozen delicacy. In the early 19th century, Italian eateries started to appear. This fashion for Italian food may explain why Parmesan ice cream features in Frederick Nutt's Royal and Imperial Cookbook of 1809.
Now, what flavour do you think that is?
Cheese?
Yeah, it is.
Is it?
It's Parmesan cheese ice cream.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Very, very creamy.
Yeah, but they had pretty high level taste, at least at the level of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley.
It's nice, I like it.
It's really rich, isn't it? You couldn't eat a lot of it. I better get on with lots of other things. But I think there's a little bit of an issue with the sturgeon, which may be very urgent.
This noble fish will be stewed in a vinegar, lemon and horseradish stock, as directed by William Henderson in the Housekeeper's Instructor of 1805. Sturgeon can grow up to 16 feet long. Even this one's a challenge.
Yeah, it's never going to go in there. What I would suggest is a bit of surgery. We can probably ornament it to such a degree people won't notice it's rather a squat, short sturgeon.
In Austen's day, the fish was common. But today, wild sturgeon are endangered. Ours had to come from a fish farm.
Right, hang on a minute, don't pull it yet. No. That's it. Look at that. No one will ever know, will they? Look.
The fish reduction complete, Ivan moves into the kitchen to turn up the temperature.
We want everything out on the table within the next 20 minutes or so. The two hot dishes that have to be ready first are the two soups. If we're going to get this stuff up there, we've got to go.
The team have worked on 63 dishes. 40 of them sweet, 23 savoury. The proof of their puddings and everything else is just 2 dances away.
Back in the ballroom, the dancers prepare for the second dance. The Savage Dance was a craze in 1813, taken from a song and dance routine in a musical based on Robinson Crusoe. Savagery on the dance floor stopped short of unbridled tropical abandon, but there was plenty of opportunity for eye contact and whispered asides.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Savage Dance.
Are they flirting while they're dancing?
Absolutely, they're flirting. There are these moments of formalised, but sort of quite physical. Everybody's wearing gloves. There's, you know, it's not flesh on flesh, but still, these moments of physical contact and movement. Jane Austen called it in another of her novels, the felicities of rapid motion. And doesn't Mr. Darcy put his finger on it, because Sir William Lucas asked him to admit that dancing is one of the sort of polite accomplishments of a civilised society. And Mr. Darcy says, every savage can dance. He's saying that these genteel people in this Hertfordshire town in the early 19th century, they're actually doing something rather primal. The dance that Elizabeth and Darcy have, she doesn't specify, but it's a dance which is movement and talk, and it clearly also pairs people off. You see them in the ball together, and you sort of see them as they are throughout the novel. Apparently resisting each other, even being slightly hostile to each other. The relationship proceeds entirely by resistance. And it's quite striking, isn't it? They have their most, in a sense, unguarded conversation while they're dancing together. Later in the novel, when they're in the same room together on their own, they're completely silent. So it's as if they need the ball to sort of release those energies. It literally acts out their mutual fascination.
It's like a fairy tale come true. It's such a joy to see the dancers in the setting, with the costumes, the hair. It's superb. It's an absolute dancer's dream.
It was so hot and the whole room just felt so much more romantic and my heart started to go and my chest. And I really felt as though I was falling in love with someone that was meant to be a potential suitor. It's wonderful how I've been completely transformed. I never thought it would be like that.
To modern readers, the interaction between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet at the Netherfield Ball does seem very, very flirtatious. But do you think it's anachronistic to use a term like flirtation for the early 19th century?
No, not at all. To us it seems like an incredibly modern conceit, but it is actually an 18th century word used quite commonly, and particularly actually in reference to balls.
You can never be seen to be flaunting any kind of immodesty by even seeming to kind of invite a man's attention. Potentially, you're risking your reputation.
It's a difficult path to tread, and it's interesting that, you know, Charlotte Lucas suggests to Elizabeth Bennet that maybe she should be slightly more forthcoming towards Mr. Darcy.
Well, and also, doesn't she say that Jane should do the same to Mr. Bingley to secure him, and that she should actually be warmer?
Yes, yeah,
than
that's
she
right,
really
to
is.
completely seal the match.
Which is interesting because there are these conduct book rules of how young women should behave.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to break the rules a bit for a courtship to move forward.
It is warm in there, but it also looks beautiful with the candles. I'm delighted that I did get a costume so that I can experience what the ball's like. I'm actually feeling quite excited. Lizzie hates it. Although everyone seems to be having quite a good time here, there are all manner of disasters and social awkwardnesses, which I suspect I may be about to experience myself. Ellie. Hello.
You look really good.
Good, thank you.
Nice. You do like it?
I do like it, actually.
I think it makes the guys look so good.
You sort of stand differently.
Yes, definitely.
Will you please play Take Your Partners for Lady Caroline Lee's Waltz?
I'm really struck by how much looking is possible, because even if you're not dancing with the man you're interested in, you could be sort of twirling about in full view.
Yeah, I think that was really brought home to me. Yes, you never get such close encounters with people and a permission to kind of stand and stare. It was said, in the late 18th century, that a man who could not dance was at a disadvantage to love because he couldn't show himself to his best form.
But the other thing which I thought was really striking is what happened when Alistair joins the dancing. Because you could see all the girls around him were really rather thrilled that he was there, and it sort of changed the temperature of that set.
All the women's eyes were on Alistair.
Yeah, so it was
and you
as
could
if-
imagine him turning up and everyone else just sort of not standing a chance, or everyone being, dazzled.
It's funny double sense. Even while you're looking at the person that you're most interested in, you hope they're looking at you, you're being watched by other people. Some very kind of private moments that people are having, but in front of everybody
blaze
else.
of publicity.
Yes, and everybody else coming to conclusions about who's with who and how they're behaving and what it tells them. Even the most intimate encounters are also a performance.
At least I didn't disgrace myself. I wasn't quite Mr. Collins. More raucous and a little bit ragged around the edges. And I think that's a good thing because it's real. And it's not that vision we have of the past in which it's extremely decorous and tightly controlled. It's like a proper ball should be. At least I think tonight I proved every savage can dance. It feels trance-like and almost mad. You wouldn't know that until you do it. And I guess that's one of the real pleasures about restaging this ball, is that we can go back to the book with a much more nuanced understanding of what Austen wrote, actually approach it almost like those very first readers in 1813.
One inescapable factor is the heat. Right on cue, Ivan's frozen punch a la romaine arrives to relieve us.
That is good.
That's lovely. That is good.
That is really good.
It's got a bit of a kick, but that's refreshing. These were traditionally served in between dances, and the idea was that it was an opportunity to scan the room and see if you could think about your next partner. If you danced twice with someone, that was a particularly good sign, especially if you're Mrs. Bennet and you notice that Jane and Bingley have danced twice. These spoons actually belong to the Prince Regent. They come from Brighton Pavilion. I think they're rather valuable as a result.
Yeah. The dance at the end, I'm sure after you've had one of these in between every dance, that dance is a fun
really
one.
enjoy it.
Yeah. I feel a bit like we could dispense with the spoons and then just down it. But that probably wouldn't be very Regency.
No.
I just need to consult my oracle here. Right, we basically need to start dishing up. We need big spoons, we need ladles, we need slices.
Down the corridor, the last dishes are ready for the waiters. In a few moments, our guests will taste a fricando of veal and the remarkable coal fowl with skewers, or attelé, garnished with crayfish, olives and black truffles. Amongst the hot fare, a favourite of Austen's, a dish of slow-roasted veal, shredded and strewn with hard-boiled egg yolks, mushrooms, force meatballs and sweetbreads.
This is a dish that gets mentioned a lot in Jane Austen's novels, particularly in Pride and Prejudice. It's a ragout of veal. This is emblematic, really, of the sort of thing that would have happened in Mr. Darcy's kitchen. And it's a dish that is heavily associated with the enemy of the period, which is France. So it's not considered really to be a patriotic dish to eat, and it's associated with foppish and high living. Mr. Hurst, who was very fashion conscious, when he discovered that Elizabeth actually preferred a plain dish to a ragout, he had absolutely nothing to say with her. So he felt that the ragout actually was a dish that was a very worthy one. OK, so could you go and get it into position?
Some dishes are hot, for now, but the roasted widgeon, a type of duck, and another favourite of Austen's, haricot of mutton, have to travel through the corridors and passages.
Now, how close are we for them?
They're waiting on us now.
Oh.
These moulded ices, set in Georgian moulds, are flavoured with bergamot, oil of orange. They would be brought into the dining room at the very last minute.
Grab the pineapple, and I want you to dress it with some myrtle leaves very quickly.
More water ices, flavoured with tamarind and alcoholic negus punch.
This is a fly-by-the-seat of your pants job, isn't it? Excuse me, folks, where's the ices?
They're gone.
Oh, no, they've got to be dressed with leaves very quickly.
A haunch of venison and a gallon of gravy are readied for the journey. A flotilla of savoury dishes head to the dining room, travelling by silver. Just time to dress the remaining sweet items that will arrive when the savouries are finished.
In Jane Austen's Emma, Mrs. Weston proposes a ball with sandwiches, but she's shouted down by the company, who agree that a ball without a supper is a fraud upon women and men.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you like to be seated for supper?
In Pride and Prejudice, eating brings everybody together in the ritual of a meal, but also divides them into two sorts of people, those with manners and those without. Do you think that's an important moment when there's the break for supper and you move on in and eat together?
Well, it's a very important moment at the Netherfield Ball in Pride and Prejudice because, of course, it's half-time, as it were. We're not told very much about what they're eating at that table, but it's clear that...
It'd be a show-offy affair.
It absolutely would be a show-offy affair.
That is like an artwork.
Mr. Bingley and his sister would have made sure that the locals, those who were lucky enough to be invited, were left in no doubt of the Bingley wealth.
Hi. The table seemed to be full. Everything here. Did you try a little bit of everything?
We tried a lot of the different meats, had hare soup.
Yeah? How was that?
That was great. It was really interesting. I've never had hare before. The fish kind of went that way, but this is very different to normal. Don't have a spread put on like this every day.
Well, Ivan was saying that it'd be weird to see how people would exchange the food.
Yeah, and leaning across as well. They were happily to just lean across and grab something and pass that to someone else and move over here. So
not that sort of, in a sense, not so polite, just quite...
No, yeah, just get in there.
People were hungry after
The meat was really good. It was cooked a bit different than I would usually cook it, and I really enjoyed it.
And I really love the whole grab it atmosphere, you know, what you can't get away with at home.
With supper in progress, a few guests sneak away to dance some Scottish reels. And that's exactly the dance that Darcy invites Elizabeth to try. She refuses to contemplate when she's staying at Netherfield Park when Jane has the flu.
In the dining room, the sweet course is arriving. By 1794, it's thought that there were over 700 confectioners in London alone. And our menu reflects just what a sweet tooth the Bingleys, Bennets and Darcys are likely to have had. 2 kinds of gâteau, 6 kinds of biscuits, a deluge of hothouse fruits, jellies, and of course, the flummeries.
That's amazing. This is basically an ice bucket.
Parmesan ice cream.
It's very bizarre, but it's gorgeous.
The way that dishes were spread out across the table at Regency Ball suppers, forcing people to help themselves and each other, made for a very lively and raucous dining experience. But it didn't stop diners from watching and listening.
So this whole thing about Mr. Darcy overhearing a conversation from the other side of the table...
Yeah? I think if you're tuning into someone talking, like I can listen to April now, but I can still hear talking about the ice cream. So, and especially if someone's being overtly loud, you will definitely pick up on what they're saying.
At the Netherfield Ball in Pride and Prejudice, what do people talk about at that table? Well, one of the things they talk about, Mrs. Bennet talks about...
Have you scored before half time?
Well, Mrs. Bennet talks very, very loudly about what she sees has been going on in the first half, and very loudly and tactlessly, because she's talking about how she thinks, already, presumptuously, she thinks her eldest daughter Jane has got Mr. Bingley, the biggest prize, the new rich young man. And Mr. Darcy can hear it all. And Elizabeth, she can see that he can hear, and that he must be sort of thinking something about how terrible her family are.
And what about the entire evening?
It's definitely been an amazing experience, because when you hear Pride and Prejudice, you're like, oh yeah, old book, like it's about olden times. But if everyone got to experience this, I think you'd just take a different look at it and just think, this is incredible.
Well, I'm glad that you've had such a good ball.
After more than 60 dishes, it's time for the final dance. The Boulanger is one of the few dances that Austen actually names in Pride and Prejudice. Its name is a reference to cheeky folk tales of amorous goings-on down at the bakery.
This dance, it's a fitting last dance because it's a saucy, rollicking showstopper.
Ladies and gentlemen, La Boulangère.
So, the very last dance. Our dance is still quite sprightly. The boulanger, the baker, who's sort of dancing with every woman in the village.
That's something else that you don't get, I think, from the book that you can see when you see these dances. You're with your partner, but you're also with lots of other people, lots of sort of exchanging of partners.
It's like men are trying you on for size.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, all that sort of jigging about. It's not actually terribly decorous or polite.
No. I think that's probably the thing that struck me most, is that, you know, the dancers we have doing it, I mean, they're young, they're fit, they're practiced, and after a couple of dances, the sweat's pouring. When it says Lydia danced every dance, you really think she's got a bit of heft in her, that girl. It is a really physical thing, and that's part of the thrill and excitement of it for people. I mean, they build up, it's as if you have to go into training. All the more reason why there's a lot of time afterwards, not just to analyse what's happened, but actually to sort of recover from it, really.
Seeing them dancing here, is there anything that you hadn't quite pictured from reading accounts of it in manuscripts?
I'm struck by how difficult it looks, but the men actually look physically quite exposed. Their clothing reveals the men's footwork. Yeah, as you find, I'm kind of gazing at their calves, like as they're doing all of those leaps and things in a way that I'm not so much drawn.
Yeah, because it's
to
hidden by
women.
their skirts.
Yeah.
So do you think it's more important for men to be able to dance well than for women?
That is kind of what I feel that I've learned. Even when you're reading Pride and Prejudice, you tend to presume that the ball is exciting for the Bennet sisters, that it's particularly important for them. But actually, for me, it's the men who seem to be facing the greatest challenge.
After I finished the waltz, I had a little bit too much punch, so I came outside, but they are still going strong, and it's so clear now just how exciting the Netherfield Ball would have been. Full of people, fine clothes, lots of booze. They're clearly having a whale of a time.
What have we learnt, really, or have we justified our focus on the ball?
I mean, the ball is very important in the plot. But in a way, you can see how the ball is so important to Austen because it sort of epitomises what the whole novel is about. A sort of set of manoeuvres, really, which are at once quite formalised, but also quite sort of sensual, and that people are kind of manoeuvring, especially Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, sort of moving around each other in a way that is kind of playful, but also restrained. And it's as if the whole of their relationship is a kind of dance.
But it's not just love, is it? We're also seeing this as a kind of vortex for snobbery and the exhibition of rank and inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah, it's all those things. The ball is taken by Jane Austen as being kind of like life.
So it's not just the dance of love, it's the dance of life.
It's about class and status and who you know, and it's about a world in which everything you do is being watched by somebody else. It's the representation of a society in which every single kind of gesture is open to interpretation by other people.
Perhaps the most important thing our ball has revealed to me is the jeopardy at play on the dance floor. In an era when marriage was unbreakable and a polite girl's only career, your future could be sealed in a single twirl. A dance was never just a dance. When Darcy and Elizabeth touch and talk, bristling hostility is giving way to irresistible attraction. Readers knew that it could only end one way.
Pride and Prejudice is the textbook novel of courtship filtered through the consciousness of the heroine. It's also an exquisite comedy of social manners, and dancing turns out to be central to both. As a social historian, I knew that a ball was a goldfish bowl for local polite society, magnifying alliances and networks, tensions and rifts. But I had no idea that dancing was such a powerful accelerator of romance.